Who runs a train? And who owns the tracks that the train runs on? That answer depends on where in the world you are. In Japan, for example, most railway companies are large corporations. They run their trains over tracks that they own, which are built on land that they also own. In the United States, passenger trains are operated by the US government. Amtrak is an agency that is funded by taxpayer dollars, and Congress established it to ensure that there would be passenger train service nationwide. But Amtrak only owns a small fraction of the total miles that they run on. The vast majority of tracks are owned by private freight companies who are required by law to give Amtrak trains priority. We can see government-run trains on privately owned tracks in other countries as well, like Canada. In Europe, the opposite is true. Throughout the 20th century, railways in each country were usually operated by the state. Starting in the 1990s, the European Union embarked on a mission to improve railway service on the continent. Part of this, of course, is providing funding for new railway projects, which they continue to do. But the EU also began to require member states to allow competition on their railways. The rationale is that government monopolies do not benefit passengers. The process of allowing competition is known as liberalization, and it is happening in multiple steps. The first step is to break up the government monopolies into several different organizations. Now, there is a separate agency dedicated to maintaining the tracks, a separate agency dedicated to running trains, etc., etc. Step 2 is privatizing these agencies in case they haven't been already. This is kind of a symbolic step because most of the time the government is still the majority shareholder, or the only shareholder. Finally, the third step is allowing other private companies access to the railway network. There are two ways companies can operate trains: compete for tenders, or operate trains on an open access basis. Does this sound like gibberish to you? I'm going to explain all of this using one particular country as an example. Today we're going to look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands recently celebrated 25 years of liberalization on the Dutch rails, and today one company in particular is standing at the front lines of the push towards competition. If you think about the Dutch railways, the colors that come into your mind will undoubtedly be yellow and blue. For decades now, these have been the colors of NS. The first train in the Netherlands ran in 1839, and for the next century, different companies built tracks and ran their trains all over the country. In 1911, these companies began to use the same fare structure, and in 1938, they were consolidated into the Nederlandse Spoorwegen, or Dutch Railways. This was a private company, but with 100% of the shares owned by the Dutch government. In 1990, this is what the Dutch railway map looked like. All service was run by NS or by neighboring countries in cooperation with NS. As a company, NS was of course interested in making money. These lines were profitable, connecting highly populated areas. But these, well, let's just say they were not priorities. Many lines had closed in the decades past, and more were slated to close in the future. Some stations only saw a train a few times a day. Then, in 1995, the government officially split NS up into several different companies. The infrastructure ultimately became property of the state in 2002. ProRail is now the company responsible for maintaining the Dutch railroad tracks. They fix the tracks, they build new tracks, and they give different companies slots to run their trains in. Companies like NS, who is now only responsible for running trains. And in 1995, the government also began to allow competitors to run trains on the railways, something NS was not too happy about. In 1996, the first competitor tried to throw their hat in the ring. Lovers Rail began operating trains for tourists and commuters starting in 1996. Their Kennemerstrand Express connected Amsterdam with the beach. After that failed, in 1998, they ran the Keukenhof Express to the tulip fields in the spring. When tulip season was over, they ran the same cars as a luxury commuter service between Amsterdam and Haarlem. Neither of these lasted very long either. Demand was just too low. It makes you wonder if NS had something to do with this. They were not happy about the competition at all. Not only did they reject integrating fares with Loversrail, rumor has it that on the first day, NS management told their station staff not to help any passengers riding Loversrail, even if these passengers were disabled or clearly needed help. Is that petty or what? Loversrail lasted 3 years and did not make much of a dent. But then in 1998, a new type of competition entered the scene, and they were here to stay. That year, a company called Oostnet replaced NS on the line between Marienberg and Almelo. Why was NS okay with being replaced? Well, because they were forced to by the government. Basically, the national railway network was split up into 2 divisions. These lines, running through more populated areas, would become the so-called main lines. The government would grant NS the exclusive rights to run trains on the main lines. These regional lines, however, became the responsibility of local governments. A local government would publish a so-called tender inviting companies to apply to run trains. Here's a little skit giving an example of how that might go. Alright, thank you all for coming today. I have these 4 beautiful regional rail lines that I want somebody to run trains on for 10 years. Now let's see. I'd like the trains to have toilets on board, and they should run every 30 minutes during the day. Oh, and let's make sure they're environmentally friendly. And you said the budget was 10 million, right? I could do it for 5 million if I just use my old trains. You don't want old trains. I can get you new trains, and if we go a little over budget, they'll have Wi-Fi. You don't want to go over budget. With my plan, we'll stay right in budget and still have the new trains. Okay, now I need you all to take what you just told me, put it in writing, add some graphs and math to make it believable, and then in a few months, I will pick one of you to run the trains. All right, everyone, welcome back. I've reviewed your proposals. Company A, you can do it for the cheapest, but you're going to use old trains, not environmentally friendly, plus no toilets. Now Company C, I really like that you were able to stay within budget and provide everything we wanted, but Company B was able to provide Wi-Fi for just a little higher price, and I think passengers will like Wi-Fi. B, we're going with you. Congratulations. I accuse the government of not doing this well. I'm taking you to court so that I can get the contract. Well, that's up to the judge to decide. The court finds that the government did not act unlawfully. Therefore, Company B may proceed with operating the contract. See, told you. Congratulations. In 10 years, I'll see all of you for another round of this. Pleasure doing business with you. Of course, in reality, it's not everybody all together in one room, but you get the picture. After 10 or 15 years, lines are retendered. Oostnet was the first company to win a tender, but as the map shows, they certainly weren't the last. Slowly, the Dutch railway map began to grow more colorful, as more and more agencies took over operations on the regional lines. Now, NS was allowed to operate trains on these regional lines, just like everyone else, but oftentimes they just didn't win. They did win a big tender in the southern province of Limburg, but soon they were accused of fraud. An investigation revealed that NS officials had bribed the previous operator to provide inside information, strengthening their bid. One of the many legal consequences was that NS lost the tender, and the €2 billion contract went to Arriva instead. That embarrassment, combined with a variety of debacles on the new high-speed line, meant that NS management decided to focus solely on the main lines and no longer compete for regional lines. And here's where my opinion is going to shine through a little bit, but I think that that's for the better. NS's performance on the regional lines was far from stellar. When I listened to stories from people who experienced it, the service back then was all but entirely neglected. The new private companies, however, brought lots of improvements. New trains, most of them built by Stadler, began to dot the landscape. Service improvements became the norm. Take the northern provinces of Groningen and Friesland, for example. Operator Arriva introduced higher frequencies on almost all of the routes. They have made improvements to the express train between the two capitals, allowing it to run every half hour. The line to Rodeschool was extended to Eemshaven to provide connections to the ferries to Germany and Norway. and a previously closed branch to Veendam was reopened. Preparations currently are underway to extend this to Stadskanaal. All trains have been converted to run on more environmentally friendly biodiesel as well. Finally, the lines were given route numbers, making them easier to remember and identify. In the southern province of Limburg, Arriva has also introduced route numbers. Here, NS only provides express service, while Arriva runs all local routes. They were able to reintroduce a direct train between the capital Maastricht and the German city of Aachen. In the near future, this international train will also be extended to Liège in Belgium, running through 3 countries. And in the east of the country, Keolis is now the main service provider. They have opened new stations, and thanks to recent electrification projects, they've raised speeds on certain lines. More importantly, they finally introduced a direct express train from Zwolle to Enschede, something the region has wanted for a long time. This train might be extended to Germany in the future. There are a few arguments against privatization, however. One is rolling stock. Companies that run a limited number of lines usually have a small fleet, which means less flexibility if one train isn't working. NS, on the other hand, has a massive fleet. The train to Aachen has had quite a few issues recently, but most of those are track issues. Similarly, operators all over the country have had to cut service because of staff shortages. For being fair, however, NS has also had to do this, so I don't see that as a strong argument against the regional providers. Most private operators are owned by foreign railway companies, and this is used as an argument against them. Dutch money is leaving the Netherlands. Such a protectionist argument isn't very convincing to me in a country that is a member of a customs union. The unhindered transit of people, goods, and services is a strength of the EU. What's more, Dutch companies do business outside the Netherlands all the time. In fact, NS itself is active in the German and UK railway scene. They're not doing too great, by the way. If a foreign company can provide better service than a domestic one can, then that should be motivation to improve the domestic service, not protect it. But those are just my thoughts. Now, those who are familiar with the railways in the United Kingdom may gruel at the thought of privatization. After all, it's the general consensus in the UK that privatization there failed. I do want to encourage you to look at it through a different lens in the Netherlands and the rest of the European Union, because there are some major differences. One such difference is that in the Netherlands and the rest of the EU, the maintenance of tracks and stations is the responsibility of a separate agency and not the train operating companies. And if you look at it, service really has improved for passengers where these regional operators have taken over. The biggest hurdle, however, and here I do have to hand it to the critics, is that in order to transfer from one operator to the other, passengers have to grab their travel card, tap out at the first company, and then tap back in with the next company. This is a huge hassle, but if you forget to do so, you could face steep fines. You really should be able to just tap in at your origin station and tap out at your destination, and in the province of Overijssel, you can. All operators except for NS have agreed to honor each other's fares, and so you only have to tap in when you begin your journey and tap out when you have arrived at your destination. The way I see it, it's a good way to combine the private and public sectors. There are the technological innovations, improved service, and reduced fares that come from competition, but also the guaranteed service that comes from government oversight and funding. So now we have NS running on the main lines and regional operators on the other lines. But some of these operators are beginning to get restless. When the government decided last year to give NS the main lines for another 10 years without a tender, it was met with quite a bit of frustration by everyone else. But they channeled that frustration into creativity. And so, this past December and January, Arriva introduced 2 new services. Arriva is originally a British company that was bought by the German railways. They're the most dominant regional operator in the Netherlands. These new services only run once a week in the wee hours from Friday night to Saturday morning. These rides only cost €10 and you have to book them online. Private operator Qbuzz, which is owned by the Italian railways, will soon introduce a similar night train between Utrecht and Dordrecht. But these services use mainline tracks, so how's that allowed? Well, aside from tendering services, companies can apply to run open access services. An open access route is not bound to a government contract, which means the financial risk falls entirely on the shoulders of the company operating it. In Germany, for example, all long-distance trains are run as an open access service, even the ones operated by DB. In the Netherlands, operators have to give ProRail a year-and-a-half notice if they plan to start an open access service. ProRail will then look to see if there's enough capacity for the service, while a government agency checks to make sure it would not directly compete with a tendered service. If it's all good to go, then a company can start running a train on its own cost. This is the procedure Arriva followed for their night trains, and their future plans rely on it as well. This past March, they announced that they are hoping to run open access trains in the north of the country on the mainline tracks NS currently runs on. Their plans include rush hour express service between Groningen and Zwolle, which would stop in Hoogeveen and Meppel, cities that have wanted express service for a long time. On the Frisian side of things, they have plans for a half-hourly local service between Zwolle and Leeuwarden, stopping at some stations that NS trains currently don't stop at. This will be supplemented by some extra rush hour service. Now, Arriva's argument is that these new trains will enhance services on the lines rather than compete with NS, because now there are even more options. To be honest, when I initially thought of creating this video, this is where I was going to stop. But in the last few weeks, some news came out that absolutely blew my mind. Arriva wants to run international high-speed trains. That's right, they've applied to run a train service between Groningen and Paris, France, via Amsterdam and Brussels. This train would leave Groningen really early in the morning and return late at night. During the midday, it would make a round trip between Paris and Amsterdam. They want to start running in 2026. Now, it's not exactly clear what trains they would use, however, being owned by the German railways, it makes you think that maybe they'd use some ICE trains. The big question is, why this big move? Well, in June, the government is scheduled to decide whether or not to include international trains as part of the mainline services contract. Now, this seems like a silly question to me since EU law specifies that international trains have to be open access, but then again, technically giving NS the sole right to operate mainline trains is against EU law too. The point is, June is the deadline for companies to make their cases about what services they'd run if they could run international trains. Flixtrain has already announced their intention to run a train from the Netherlands to Germany, and just a few days after Arriva's big announcement, QBuzz presented their plans to run to Paris and Berlin in 2027, as well as a domestic service between Amsterdam and Eindhoven. Now, QBuzz is owned by the Italian railways, and they've said that they want to run their flagship Frecciarossa trains on the Dutch tracks. I have to tell you, I could not be more excited to see the sleek Frecciarossa in the Netherlands. The Italians know a thing or two about high-speed competition. Since Italo began competing with the national railways on the busy corridors in Italy, prices dropped, service improved, and the railways basically annihilated the market share that airlines used to have between major cities. The Frecciarossa is currently also competing head-on with the national railways in France and Spain. The Netherlands is a logical next step. It remains to be seen what will happen with all these ambitious plans. Once again, in high-speed rail, I am all for a little bit of competition, especially because with the monopoly that NS has now, it kind of feels like not a lot is being done. The high-speed trains to Paris are running at full capacity, but there's no sign of a fleet expansion or service expansion. And the Eurostar just announced that they'll probably not be able to serve the Netherlands for an entire year. If it all works out, we may see a Dutch railway map that looks a little bit like this. In 40 years, just see how much will have changed from the monopoly that NS once had for so long. Thanks for sticking with me through such a complicated subject. I hope you learned a thing or two. What are your thoughts? Should there be more competition in the high-speed sector? Are you excited to see these new trains? Let me know in the comments below. Please subscribe to Trains Are Awesome, and we'll see you next time.